Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, Reparations, What It Looks Like and How We Get There. I'm Anand Jahi, and I'm the Program Director at the New Economy Coalition. This webinar is part of New Economy Week, which is a week of public conversation and action towards building an economy that works for people and planet. Each day, we pose a key challenge to building the new economy. Today's challenge is, how do we build an economy where Black lives matter? What are the economic tools and strategies that will dismantle systemic racism and move us closer to collective liberation? In this conversation, we'll be talking about reparations, which is an idea that's probably as old as slavery or uncompensated labor itself. David Walker called for reparations for slavery in 1829. The federal government advocated and advanced the policy of reparations for a short amount of time during and after the Civil War, and many prominent Black leaders and organizers have advocated for reparations in the years since. Last May, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Atlantic article, The Case for Reparations, threw a national spotlight on the debate and movement for reparations, which have largely existed under the radar. Reparations was suddenly a topic of national debate, but the debate tended to focus on the merits of the idea itself and minimized questions of what reparations for African Americans could actually look like. In the months that followed, police killings of unarmed African Americans set off a wave of protest and resistance that swept through Ferguson, Missouri, New York City, Baltimore, and most major cities across the country, catalyzing Black Lives Matter's growth into a national Black liberation movement. But despite the attempts of many activists and organizers, much discussion of the movement has focused narrowly on police procedures and protocols and not on potential solutions to the systemic racism at the root of state-sanctioned violence. I'm joined today by Ed Whitfield. Originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, Ed's political activism started with attending Little Rock Central High School and beginning to do anti-war work as a teenager. Ed retired after 30 years in industry before becoming involved with philanthropy. He now speaks and writes on issues of cooperatives and economic development, while continuing to be interested in issues of war and peace, as well as education and social responses to racism. Ed serves on the boards of Carolina Common Enterprise, Highlander Research and Education Center, and the New Economy Coalition. In his work with the Fund for Democratic Communities, the Southern Grassroots Economies Project, and the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, Ed Whitfield has been at the forefront of not just envisioning, but actively building a new economy grounded in justice, democracy, and sustainability. Thanks for joining us, Ed.
Thank you for having me here.
So I wanted to jump right into it, but first I wanted to ground this conversation in some historical context. So the first question I'd like to ask of you is, can you give us an overview of African Americans' demands for reparations and touch on how those demands have evolved or manifested themselves differently over time?
The time period I would be interested in looking at is particularly the time since the end of slavery. That's when people who had been grievously misused by the systemic and brutal dehumanizing slave system were being freed of that slavery in the context that the people who were being compensated tended to be the people who had owned them as slaves rather than they themselves, for having done all the work and labor of building the economy and helping building up the wealth of this country. So there were some interesting discussions that took place during that time period about what would it mean to be free, what had slavery meant to folk. In particular, there was an event that happened in January 12th of 1865. There was a meeting in Savannah, Georgia, of 20 African American leaders who had been themselves, all but one of them had at some point been enslaved. One had been born free. Many of the rest of them, some of them were only freed from slavery when the Union Army came through. Some others had bought their way out of slavery, and think about somebody who pays $1,000 or $1,200 for the freedom of themselves and their family back in 1865. That was a lot of money, but people had really wanted to be free. One of the questions that came up in the meeting with General Sherman and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, was, what had slavery meant and what would freedom mean to them? And they made it clear that the answer, I think, is very telling in terms of what it is that people wanted then. And I think it's very informative to us to think about what it is that we need now. Because they said slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it, is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor and take care of ourselves. And it's amazing after a period of so much brutality that the answer to what had been the fundamental nature of that brutality and what would be the fundamental nature of freedom from it came in such clearly economic terms. And that, is something that I have to think about when I think about the whole question of what is the relationship between economic justice and social justice, for instance. And these folk who could have said any number of things, they could say, freedom is not getting beat with a lash anymore, and certainly it would include that, or freedom is being able to go wherever you want to with your family, and certainly it would include that. But the fundamental way they thought about freedom was having control over the product of their own labor and being able to use it to take care of themselves. And I think that, growing out of that, within a few days, Sherman issued what was General Order Number 15 that called for 40 acres of land to be made available to people who were in this is in the Sea Island area. They had confiscated about 400,000 acres, and they were making these 40-acre plots to be available. And this grew into the whole terminology and thinking about 40 acres on a mule. The initial order didn't mention mules, but it certainly talked about the land, and the military had mules available. But the whole idea of giving people something that they needed to work with in order to be able to do for themselves and take care of themselves and their families. Later in that same meeting, there was explicit discussion around the fact that people would be able to take care of themselves, their children, the elderly, and have something left over for the future. Um, so this was the early discussion around it. Now there have been, and that wasn't exactly a discussion around reparations, as those former slaves and representatives of the black community were expressing themselves. They were talking about being willing to buy the land. They said they wanted to be able to work it and then pay for it and own it and move from there. But I still think that it sets a kind of basis for thinking about reparations as a means to give people the opportunity that has been so systemically taken from people, which is capacity to do things for themselves and provide for their own well-being, with all of the human dignity that comes along with that. Um, there have been a number of moves that have taken place and actions that have taken place with proposed legislation. One of the ones that comes to mind is in 1999, the African World Reparation and Reparation Truth Commission called for the West to pay $777 trillion to Africa within 5 years. Now, that didn't happen. It really didn't. Uh, I've seen estimates as low as a few $1 trillion to people in the high billions of dollars as to how much money is owed when people talk about it. I've heard discussions about reparations that made use of models that people have seen before in terms of checks for a certain amount of money being issued. I know people who will tell you that they're kind of waiting for their check. Um, I've heard vulgarizations of the idea go to the point of talking about we ought not be talking about 40 acres on a mule. We ought to be talking about 40 acres on a Bentley. That really misses the whole idea that that the discussion of these early leaders in our community after after the end of their enslavement was that they wanted to be productive. They weren't trying to set themselves up as consumers. A lot of the ways you could conceive of getting paid, particularly if you're thinking of this just simply as being paid for lost wages, is to think about getting some amount of money that you would use to buy some stuff. A recent article in Yes Magazine, somebody in talking about reparation was saying, well, of course people should use money for whatever they want to use it for because, there shouldn't be a restriction on what people are going to do. And in and of itself, I think this is kind of thinking that leads back into a kind of a support for a consumerist model of how we live and how we value ourselves and that fits very much into the old economy. And I think that we ought to go back to these early leaders and think about this idea that they had, that they wanted to have an opportunity to be fully productive. Um, in recent years, there have been people who have introduced legislation uh, at the federal level in the United States for reparations. By and large, this legislation has been, non-starters. They often don't get out of committee, and certainly we don't think that in recent years we've ever been on the brink of passing any reparations legislation that would have any meaning. There have been mild-mannered apologies offered, but typically with no compensation whatsoever. Um, Again, we have to remember that part of the history was that in some places in the Western world, it's hard to even think about slavery just as it affected North America, given that there was a whole Atlantic slave system that was being participated in by people from across Europe and North America, and colonizers who had moved here to this part of the world. So the point when Britain, for instance, gave up its slave system, they made available, I think, funds were made available, something like 46,000 previous slave owners to to compensate them for this loss of capital. Um, and I think that throughout almost all of those discussions, there was precious little, almost no discussion made as to what was it that those Africans who had been enslaved and their progeny, what did they deserve out of this?
Hmm.
And this is where I think that the reparations discussion is still relevant today. Um, there are a couple of interesting things that I hear about as people raise it now. One is that, well, we don't have to go all the way back to slavery. And I'm not sure why people would want to not go back to talking about some of the roots of the generation of the huge piles of finance capital and profits that exist and continue to fuel the economies of the Western world. I mean, it was the slave system that helped to finance the Industrial Revolution, and it was certainly the Industrial Revolution and its profits that stay with us. But it's really clear that some communities benefited from this. Many other communities were primarily punished by these developments. And so to me, the whole idea of reparations is a question of how is it that we repair this disparate impact, this difference to communities that occurred when some communities were given the benefit of owning the product of the labor of other communities, as these ministers pointed out in 1865. It's interesting, this is the 150th anniversary of those discussions having taken place. And it kind of struck me the other day that, I haven't heard any big celebrations about that. This is the 150th year following the end of slavery, and a wide range of experiments that were being done as to how to fairly treat those people who had previously been enslaved, um, and whose communities can be identified to this very day by virtue of the things that we are still incapable of doing for ourselves in those communities.
So you touched on a lot there, including some contemporary politics around reparations. But before we, move on to talk about present day, I wanted to talk a little bit about that period that you mentioned, 1865, the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. General Sherman issued his order, and if I'm not mistaken, the Freedmen's Bureau did begin distributing
Yeah,
land to former slaves, and then
for about a
that
year.
process reversed itself. So can you talk a little bit about what happened and why that happened?
Yeah, what they said, the class struggle continues, and the oppressive national struggle was continuing too. There were any number of factors and forces at work during that period. There was a big debate, for instance, as to whether or not people should be offered land so that they could be productive, or should they be given jobs so that they could produce for somebody else. And so there were gigantic northern interests, some of which had been even supportive of abolition, that were interested in investing in the South, but it was not to their advantage to have Southern lands go to the previously enslaved. Rather, they wanted to own those lands and then have people as wage labor. Um, if you think about slavery as a system where you give people just enough food to eat so they can get by, enough clothes to wear so they're not completely naked, enough housing so they don't freeze to death in the winter, and then you work them and you take everything that they make for them. And the industrial system as it existed was different. It paid people enough money so that they could have clothes to wear, and paid people just enough money so they had just enough to eat, and it placed a roof over their head, and then it worked them and kept everything that they produced. So it was a shift, but if you even think about what the call was from those ministers, they wanted the product of their own labor. That's a shift that most people in this country still have a need to see take place. But in that time period, 1865, there was only a very brief period of time when land was made available. Shortly after that, there were any number of compromises. One thing happened was that the land that had been confiscated from uh, the Southern rebels was given back to them. There was the emphasis was on healing the nation rather than on continuing to punish the South. And then where that wasn't going on, there were again northern financial interests buying up large quantities of land. Now, there was a period of time when the black community was very much caught up in the importance of land ownership, and it peaked around 1915. There were advocates, in the community, um, from pretty conservative advocates, folk like Booker T. Washington, to much more progressive ones that would stress the importance of land ownership, and people went out of their way to find ways to get to own some land. There were some people who may have picked up some land out of some land grant situations, but many other people found ways to fight and struggle to buy land. Some of them bought land from their former owners. And it's interesting to remember that land is a resource that's not productive in and of itself. It's productive only if you have enough labor to work it. So there were people with huge expanses of land that had little that they could do with it, given that they no longer had the slave labor force that they made it productive with. And some of these people were willing to sell that land to the former slaves. I know in Mississippi there was a Davis Bend area that ended up, in fact, it had been owned by the brother of Jefferson Davis. But they had tried to set it up as a model plantation area. And I don't know how much of a model it was, but I'm sure that there are variations into the severity of slavery even. But after the Civil War ended, a number of the people from that community went on to come to own the land that they had previously worked and develop the all-black community in western Mississippi of Mountain Bayou is one of the things out of that. But overall, there was an incredible abandonment of any kind of progressive efforts during Reconstruction to assist the formerly enslaved. The political shift in this country and the level of violence and the racism that exists in this country, North and South, let folk have very few supporters in Washington where those policies could be maintained. And I think what it came out as was Circular 13, or Circular 12 or 13 of the Freedmen's Bureau that had to do with the division of the land was then repealed. And that land was taken away from people who it had been made available to. It's also interesting to know that almost all of the experiments that were done with making land available to people so that they could work it were successful. The only shortcoming of them was not enough land and more people crowding onto it wanting to work than it had room for. But there was plenty of land that potentially could have been distributed in this way. At the same time, there was a big push in the country toward colonization, where folk were being encouraged to go back to Africa. Any number of folk thinking that black and white folk could not live side by side just due to the inherent differences by race. And it's not at all clear exactly what anyone means by that. Certainly people had been brutalized and mistreated and left to fend for themselves without the assets they needed to build a wholesome life that they would have wanted to. But this got translated in some folks' mind into inherent differences between the races. And we have a lot of that thinking that remains with us today in terms of this assumption that these folks are just different. It's like, and everybody talks about race being a social construction, but people actually deep down kind of feel it and act it to be more of a social reality that has its implication, that causes people to act in a certain way, as opposed to people's actions, in particular racism, generating these differences and divisions between people.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that historical context that you're giving. I have one more kind of historical question for you, and then I'd like to talk about the contemporary moment that we're in and what reparations would mean right now. In Ta-Nehisi Coates' pieces last year, he argued that reparations are owed not just because of slavery, but because of systemic racism of the 150 years since the end of slavery. So we're talking about Jim Crow, housing segregation, educational inequity, mass incarceration. What what are reparations for?
I believe it's for all of those things, but I don't want to abandon the part of it that was for the things that happened during the slave period. And the reason why is because I think that the slave period set the conditions for all of those subsequent things that you described, and it also initiated some of the initial capitalization financing of the things that you later described. And so for that reason, it doesn't need to be taken out of the equation. I don't find a stronger argument to be made for reparations by saying, well, let's not even go back to slavery. The fact that it was a long time ago doesn't have anything at all to do with the benefits from that period not persisting with us to this day. You know, I spent a lot of time reading, thinking about studying slavery, not because I like to read or think about unpleasant periods of time a long time ago, but because I'm trying to understand the world that we live in right now. And in order to understand the world that we live in right now, I think we have to understand, again, this huge division in wealth that took place at a time when the wealth was being systemically extracted from one community on the basis of, again, genocide and land theft that had taken place to come very close to destroying another community, the indigenous population here. And then this wealth was piled up in such a way that it has continued into the future, and it continued behind the banking crisis. It was part of what was in the banking crisis. It's what I like to talk about as a big pile of money on the table that speculators and gamblers sit down to, hoping that they could win their share and then make the argument, well, I didn't steal it. Yeah, you didn't steal it, but you were sat at a table loaded with stolen money. And at the point you're sitting at a table loaded with stolen money, you can't ignore the moral implications of you taking that money and the people whose communities that money was stolen from continuing to suffer for the lack of it.
Thanks for that. Um, so, like you said, we're looking back at the history to understand this moment that we're in right now. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your work and how that ties into the current fight for reparations. And before you answer that, I just want to let people watching on YouTube or participating in the webinar, I want to encourage you to submit your own questions for Ed that we'll start taking in a couple minutes.
Okay, so you want to talk about what kind of work we're doing now?
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the Fund for Democratic Communities is working to develop the Southern Grassroots Economies Project, which grows out of concern we have that the U.S. South, which again is an area of persistent ongoing poverty, needs to engage in new economic activity along the lines that are going to benefit communities as a whole, and particularly benefit those communities that are most affected by economic crises, least likely to benefit from recoveries from those crises. So we're talking about the African American community, but we're also including and talking about in our work communities of low-income white folk, certainly Native and Indigenous communities, and now we're even including in our work immigrant communities, people who come into this country, and certainly Hispanic communities, some of whom are immigrants, some of whom have been here and had land stolen from them, part of the land grab that took place. So these are the folks that we're talking about benefiting, because all of these groups play prominent roles in the life and economy of the South right now. One of the projects we've been working on has to do with the accessibility of resource finance to people who live in those communities that, again, have been damaged by the history of the South as part of the history of the country. You know, we don't isolate the South from the country and think that somehow bad things happen here while wonderful things were going on in Massachusetts. It's pretty clear to us that the problems in this country have been countrywide, but that some sectors of the country have experienced those problems in more intense ways. And we're located in the South. We have limited resources. We're focusing on work here. One of the finance activities is developed the Southern Reparations Loan Fund. And somebody asked me the question not long ago, is like, well, if you're talking about reparations, why are you talking about lending money? That means you want to get it back. The Southern Reparations Loan Fund isn't something that stands outside of the South to lend money into the South that it will then get back. But it is in the South, of the South, to be part of how resources can be directed into the South and directed toward benefiting communities as a community, not individual entrepreneurs as much as communities as a whole. One of the things that I would want to offer is that the basic unit on which we ought to evaluate the success of our work is certainly not the individual, it's not even the enterprise, and it's bigger even than the family. Not all of us are in the traditional families with, a mother and father and 2.3 children and a picket fence and half a car, whatever it is. A lot of us don't structure ourselves that way, but we're all part of communities that are interdependent on each other in such a way that whether we have chosen to have children and have families, whether we've chosen to have traditional or non-traditional spouses and mates, etc., we're part of community and have a role to play in the life of that community and need to be supported and respected as full humans inside that community. So to me, the community is the unit that we have to be concerned with. As such, the work of the Southern Reparations Loan Fund is to identify how we can build up community-based, community-owned economies that end up benefiting the whole community, that are deeply embedded in the community and share the benefits to the people of the community in a fair and equitable way, built on democratic principles of a democratic types of ownership that are not built on the kind of individual ownership that allows people to extract wealth from each other.
Okay, that's helpful. So a set of the questions that I had for you were logistical questions about, when we talk about reparations, what exactly are we talking about? The who, what, how type of questions. And so I think you touched on some of those questions just there. We're talking about communities and not necessarily individuals receiving. And when we talk about what, you're not necessarily talking about just cutting a check and that's the end of it. You're talking about some type of investment. Can you talk a little bit more about the who, what, where is the money coming from, where is it going, who's deciding, those types of questions?
Yes, that's very important. One of the conceptions of reparations is this is something we need to get from the government. We all know how the federal government gets money. It's fundamentally through taxing individuals. So you would basically be calling upon the government to set up a tax structure to get money from people that's going to give it back to people, and there are going to be all kind of issues of which people it should go to. I think that there's certainly some responsibilities that the government ought to take up in this regard. But I don't think that the government alone is the beneficiaries of the years of injustice and extraction and exploitation that have taken place. And as such, not only the government, but also other concentrations of wealth that have benefited by this are prime sources, in my mind, for money that ought to be available for repairing the damage of those periods of time that we've identified, all the way to the slave period and several subsequent periods, including periods today. So all of the folk who are benefiting from it ought to be available to talk about giving back. So several years ago, I think it was a newspaper article or something that I wrote that said, well, why don't we just let people start voluntarily, those people who already recognize the need, start voluntarily engaging in reparations? Why are we going to wait for the government to do? And particularly, I don't like waiting for the government to do things that it doesn't seem like they're about to do. So, we could sit and wait and wait and wait and talk about it, or we can try to create some kind of thing that hopefully shifts the power so that even the question of how the government gets to be involved can be more real as we move down the line. Because of two things. One, that we set examples of what it is that we're talking about that makes sense to people. Two, we continue to make the argument, but not in the abstract, but in the concrete as it relates to what it is that you can do for and what it means to communities. And three, on the basis of that we develop and broaden the kind of mass of people who recognize the need for this transformation to take place. And there's some people right now who will voluntarily tell you that the wealth that they have access to was not a product of their own effort, and that they are willing to make available to communities that they recognize having been injured by the methods by which that wealth was extracted. So I know people in a group called Regenerative Finance right now that I'm willing to kind of call out, who are working at finding ways to transfer some of the wealth that they personally have access to as the children of people who have had access to money before. One of the best ways to get rich in this country is to select rich parents. You got to pick them carefully now. You keep parents rich enough and you have really a whole lot of money. Most of us who kind of come in that on the other end don't know that we're picking our parents out when we do this and just stuff them with whatever we got. But people who did pick the really rich ones, some of them realize it's like, well, I didn't generate this money. There's a lot of confusion as to whether or not all of the money was fairly gained. But again, I want to go back to that analogy about people who have gambled at a table loaded down with stolen goods. Now, people don't necessarily initially recognize that or think about it that way. In fact, that's not a very popular way of thinking about how you become rich in a rich country. But I would offer that people who have gotten rich in a rich country should think about what would happen if they took exactly the same set of skills, interest, the same drive and ambition to some South Sea island where there wasn't a big pile of money to gamble with that on, and see how rich they got out of it then. You know, you're not going to develop the next Facebook where there's not an internet. It's just not going to happen that way. So these things are all connected to the wealth of a community and the fact that that has been extracted again through years and years. So people who have access to that, some of them can voluntarily engage in processes where they make it available. The other is that there's a big movement where people are recognizing certain kind of ecological damage that is taking place in this country, particularly investment in fossil fuels, where people are called on to divest from those and are looking for where should I invest my money if I shouldn't be doing it in these carbon-based economies. And then the question again of investing it in communities that are looking to do something for themselves on the basis of community-based ownership, where again the profits from the activity of that community of people remain with that community of people to continue to benefit them in the future. And that's again what it is that the Southern Reparations Loan Fund is trying to structure. And the reason it's a loan is that we think about, like any other set of commonly accessible goods and resources, we want to, after we have finished using them, we want to return them in as good or better condition for our children and their children after them to make use of it. So this is money that is brought in to help us be productive in such a way that it can be replenished and made available to other generations to also become very productive in their communities.
So in your answer, you raised this issue of power. And when talking about who reparations are coming from, there's definitely wealthy people who have expressed a willingness to move towards reparations. But I want to ask you about, what about people who have accumulated wealth, who aren't willing, and might need some type of confrontation there? How do we build the power to get to that point? And I'm going to return back to 1865. You know, one of the reasons that we got to that point was that African Americans had emerged as this very important population. They emerged as a powerful population during the Civil War at a time when the federal government really wanted to leverage that power. And I think that was one of the reasons why they started that initial program of reparations. So how does building political power, play into the current movement for reparations?
I mean, power has everything to do with everything we need to do or change. You know, power is the capacity to change things beyond where they're already going on their own. So it's the power to stop things that are moving under their own inertia. It's the power to start things that by their own inertia would stand still or move very slowly. So we're always needing to think about how we build power. Ultimately, power is connected with how we develop relationships among people. because in the final analysis, the kind of power that has to be built has to do with people having some level of unity of direction. So part of the power building has to do with clarifying the ideas in people's minds, also building the level of organization that is required for people to effectively move effectively ascertain even what their collective ideas are, as well as moving those ideas to reality. One of the aspects where in places that takes place in this country is around the political arena, but it's hardly the only one. In fact, we need to be clear that the transformation in how the political franchise took place in an arena outside of the political voting booth. People did not vote to gain the right to vote. Um, so that the question of power has to do with the organization and mobilization of mass movements. It has to do with the organization and mobilization of people's productive efforts. Potentially, it has to do with people's capacity to withhold their own labor from certain kinds of situations. It has to do with the participation and the character of the participation that the mass of the population plays in the ongoing role. It's a question of business as usual or no business as usual. And by that, I don't mean interrupting the ordinary flow of people's everyday lives as much as I do figuring out ways of interfering with or intervening in the collective kind of oppressive activities that the society continues to maintain and continue to engage in. And so all of those are, we see young people in the street engaging in very powerful moves. And some people would question the fact, well, if they do that and then they don't vote, then they haven't done anything. That's foolishness. If they do that, and whether they vote or not vote, they have still done something. There are additional things that can be done through engaging in and making good use of the electoral process. It's also very important for people to realize the incredible energy sink that can be when sometimes people put almost all of their efforts into that with very, very little meaningful results. When more efforts can be put into more direct connections with building relationships and communities. And often there's a lot of energy put into national elections where much more transformative things could happen on a local area if people would recognize that possibility. So there are a number of forms of people need to organize. But again, the two aspects of power that are important for me are our ideas of what it is we're trying to do and the organized structures that effectively do them working together with each other, building relationships to build structures. And then there are a wide range of arenas in which power can and needs to be exercised for the changes that we need.
So I want to stay on this topic of power a little bit and turn to an article that Adolph Reed wrote in, I think it was 2000, it was 15 years ago. It was after Randall Robinson had released The Debt, and there was a lot similar to last year when Ta-Nehisi Coates released his piece. There was a lot of national attention and conversation about reparations. And Adolph Reed, he leveled a number of criticisms about the reparations cause in general, but one was that he argued that we were at a moment when there was potential for broad-based movements across race, and he argued that the idea of reparations was divisive, that it drove a wedge between poor blacks and poor whites and what could be a potential political alliance there. So I want to ask you, what do you think? Do you think the idea of reparations is divisive? Is it dividing poor blacks from poor whites or from other minorities that could coalesce into some type of powerful alliance?
I don't think it is. I don't think that we need to try to figure out how to forge a very powerful alliance on the basis of not telling the truth and not sharing what people actually need. So I think we have to not omit from the discussion things that should be included, but rather include some things that often are not. One is the fact that what those ministers in their church talked about wanting access to the product of their own labor, is something that working class white people need and don't have either. They need to understand that. Now, that's a hard chunk of work, but I don't think that we correct that by not talking about how labor has been extracted from the black community. So I'm not one who favors kind of let's just not say the things about what we need and we'll get everybody there. I think it's important to draw people to the table, and I'm looking for a broad group of folks coming to the table on the basis of the full respect for what everybody needs and everyone's full humanity, not by omitting part of it in the hopes that other people who don't respect our humanity will be attracted to that. I don't think that in the long run, in a significant way, that they are. And I think that there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done in terms of organizing working class white people that really is very important to do, that there are far too few people actively doing it in effective kind of ways. But I would take that task on long before I would say that the way to do it is just leave some stuff off the table, don't talk about it, in hopes that they'll come around and recognize that, you know, that level of deception isn't going to work in the long run to building the kind of unity, because there's got to be a unity that can withstand a lot of blows, and the only way for that unity to happen is on people fully respecting each other and what their real needs and real histories are.
Hmm. All right, so I have one more question for you, and then we've got a number of questions from people who are watching online. So the last question from me that I'll ask is, how does this tie in, how does the Black Lives Matter movement tie into the movement for reparations?
Um, it's interesting. You know, at some level, the Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of the struggle for dignity, for humanity that has come for the hundreds of years that we have been in this hemisphere. Um, it comes at a time when the labor needs of the existing economy have shifted, and the social control needs of it have accelerated given the fear that that people are not going to respect the levels of control that are required to be subservient in a system that doesn't meet their needs. There's also an effort afoot to split people by what is called race, but it's really splitting people by racism, where some people are given certain benefits from persisting in their racism, and other people calling attention to it are excluded and dehumanized by virtue of the activities of the mass media, as well as politicians in office and the mean-spirited comments that come on Facebook posts, some of which are kind of incredible. We have to again build these movements. The Black Lives Matter movement. When I was in Cleveland for the Movement for Black Lives gathering, and it was an amazing kind of intergenerational amalgam of very young people to elderly folk like me, and even some folk older than I am. It's hard to believe, but even older, who come to express, you know, as one, our respect for our own humanity. Uh, right now, there are a lot of people within that movement that are struggling to break out of simply resisting the old forms of oppression and again find ways to elevate the capacity of our community to do things for itself and be fully human in that way. So that's one of our challenges, is to work on ways that we integrate these economic struggles around community ownership and the transformation of the economy, and also the challenges that need to take place to the type of private ownership that on a world scale has something like 80 families owning as much wealth as half of humanity's, 3.5 billion people. That is obscene. So we have to find ways that are transformative around this question of the nature of ownership.
Hmm.
Listening to a seminar yesterday, I heard somebody brilliantly say that oh, we've reached a point where nobody owns anything. You know, we have these super fiduciaries and sovereign wealth funds, and nobody owns anything. And yet, huge numbers of people in the world and in this country suffer under not having access to what they need in order to work, while other people live luxurious lives with high levels of control on the basis of their ownership of stuff that they only won gambling at the table loaded with stolen money if they didn't directly steal it themselves.
Hmm.
And so this is a transformation that has to take place in the world in order for black lives to fully matter. Because other than that, black lives and black bodies are used as tools and instruments of extraction into that ownership structure that again leaves a handful of people owning everything and controlling everything, while the rest of us suffer to work or to not work and just be extraneous populations to be warehoused. And that's part of the situation that has led to the social control activities on part of local police departments, local governments, and all kind of folk that again are based on the fact that our community does not have control of access to the resources that it needs to do for itself.
Thanks. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left, and we've gotten a number of questions from people online, so I want to turn to some of those. The first is, how does black nationalism factor into both your conception of reparations and conceptions of reparations generally?
I used to be a black nationalist. I really did. That was a good one. Uh, but one of the things that struck me and made me rethink part of my black nationalist feelings was this question of whether or not I was willing to replace white capitalists with black ones. Because within the arena of black nationalist ideology, there's no clarity whatsoever that you wouldn't do that. Because if you see the oppression as simply being oppression that takes place because of the race that you are, once you get rid of white folk being that race and replace them with black folk doing that, then you've kind of you've won. And you know, black faces in high places doesn't cut it for me. I think that we deserve much more than that. And again, I go back to what my brothers were saying in 1865. We want to be able to do for ourselves and control the product of our own labor. And I don't think that black nationalism has built into it an understanding of those relationships and the way that they need to be corrected.
Um, so talking, I guess, moving outside of this national conversation we've had, you talked a little bit about, I think, some African nations calling for reparations, but we had one question from somebody on YouTube. They said, David Cameron recently said on a trip to Jamaica, we do not believe reparations is the right approach. How do we take this discussion and knowledge presented here and build a Caribbean strategy and a diasporic strategy?
Take the video from this and send it to them. And then, we have to create opportunities for dialogue. I know any number of people that would, the Adolph Reed argument that you made is one of the arguments that people make. I think it's something people should talk about. I think it's important for people to talk about why they think some things are important, why they think some other things aren't. I know I've gotten in trouble with people for saying that if you granted reparations, giving people a bunch of money, then I would wish that I was selling sneakers or fancy cars, because I would use the fact that people got a lot of checks to sell a bunch of sneakers and fancy cars. And some folks found it insulting that I would say that. I only asked them to look at the actual history of how some things have unfolded over time. So there are going to be some disagreements and some dialogue around this. I really hope that we can deepen the dialogue, in particular around this conception of, don't we want to make reparations available for the development of those communities that have been robbed blind? Don't we want to make them available for that development? And in doing so, don't we need to create democratic structures, democratic financial structures that are capable of democratizing wealth and making, again, wealth fairly and equitably developed is available to communities as a means of taking the wealth back that needs to be returned to our communities and making it available to people on an equitable kind of basis.
Great. We have one question that's asking for specific examples. So maybe this could come from F4DC, but can you give a specific concrete example of a community that should receive reparations and that maybe has, and how it's been, or those types of funds and how they've been used?
Well, first of all, the communities I think that should receive them are all the ones that have been damaged. The examples I can give are just where I know people are actually concretely doing some of the work that I'm describing. So certainly the movement around trying to build cooperative enterprises and communities to meet community needs is one of the things, one of the forms that I would want, reparation stuff to go into. I'm directly involved with such an effort here in Greensboro, North Carolina right now, where we have a community that is a food desert, that is an overwhelmingly black, uh, predominantly working class community, that the grocery store left in 1998. That people have been wanting to get a grocery store. And again, the conception is drag some entrepreneur in, so he'll spend a bunch of money, put a store there, and it's going to meet some community needs through its services. And when we offered to them the fact that it would be possible for you to build your own store, and you own it, and then you get to keep the profit, and you get to design it to be as pretty and as nice as you want it to be, wouldn't this be better? And people said, well, of course. We just didn't know you could do that. And in particular, like, where would you get the resources from? One of the sources of the financing for that store has been an effort like what I was describing earlier, where young people with wealth have made available some very patient capital through an organization that's in New York, the Working World, but money generated by regenerative finance to help pay for there being a grocery store in this majority black community here in Greensboro, North Carolina, to meet community needs. And again, the community needs are not just the availability of pickles and mayonnaise and onions and fresh tomatoes, but the community needs are also the creation of good jobs. So, and the community need is also the retention of profit from an enterprise in the community and the revitalization of the community. So we got 9 people on an elected board of directors that are elected by 650 or more members of this co-op that are directing the utilization of about $2 million that have been generated through a variety of means, including an appeal to local government that was able to get a few $100,000 of this money. But again, a larger piece of the money has come through this process that is going to be done along the same kind of non-extractive financial methods that are being developed by the Southern Reparations Loan Fund. So this is, part of the work that we're engaged in here locally now.
Great. We got a really good question on YouTube from Deirdre Smith. She wants to know, how does land reclamation fit into your vision of reparations, and how does it relate to indigenous sovereignty?
Did you say land reclamation?
Mm-hmm. How does land, we've been talking a lot about, just kind
I
of
got you.
owned. Mm-hmm.
Land is so interesting. There's some really advanced thinking on the role that land plays that people, a guy named Henry George did around the turn of the century that almost nobody is familiar with now. But after having heard about it, I realized that he was a very thoughtful person. Absolutely important that land is one of the factors of modern economic reality. Finance takes a funny kind of role as it relates to land, in as much as finance can be used as a key to access to land. In other words, finance can mirror all of the factors of production. If you got enough money, you can get some labor. You got enough money, you can get some land. You got enough money, you can get some machinery. So, money in a way plays that kind of role. But land reform are crucial in the long run look at things. I drive across the South a lot, and I look at these areas, these huge expanses of land, thousands and thousands of acres of land that are owned by individuals who we know didn't produce, didn't make, didn't manufacture a single square inch of that land. And yet their control over it sets the basis for the financial and economic control that they have over people's lives, and whether or not people can eat. Whether or not you can access to land and grow some food on is whether or not you can eat. So I think land reform is absolutely important. I think that indigenous communities across this country who have had their land systemically stolen from them have a really, really crucial role to play in any kind of just new economy that is constructed. I think that the question of land is an important issue to think about when you think about colonization. It's like, why is it that the slaves who had been stolen away from Africa weren't interested in going back and were willing to live on this land? And I think it has to do with the fact that they realized that their labor had gone into this land, and also it helped pile up this pile of resources that allowed them to have an access to the kind of life that they were capable of generating in the use of land. So land was always important, and it continues to be an important factor. Um, but it is an important factor now in conjunction with the pile of resources that have been created utilizing that land and living human labor, and that have been accumulated and add to it and make even more productive that labor on that land.
Okay.
And if that's not and there's so much to be figured out about land that we haven't figured out and don't know yet, but it remains an important question.
Um, what are some steps that Black organizers and networks can take towards real action on reparations? What can we do to make this a reality?
One, I think we can start talking about it in a way where we try to connect it to something we actually want to do with it. Again, I think we have to break out of the consumer mindset that, I really, really would like a nice bigger house, and I really would like, really, really fancy, and if I got my check, I could do that. We got to get past that to thinking about how is it that we can look at our communities, identify our communities' needs, and then talk about how we systemically, starting from some place where we can start, on the basis of some skills and information that we have access to, begin to build up the economies that are able to meet our needs in our communities. As we begin to do that, I think we can build together and move forward further along this whole dialogue about how we access the resources from this pile of money, this stolen pile of money that continues to sit on the table. Get some of the children who have access to that pile of money to pass some of it along, but continue to fight and build the power to get that pile of money off the table and back into the communities where it belongs. And so this is a matter of people working together, upholding the importance of the economic activities along these lines, along with all that we have to do to defend ourselves and our communities from the ongoing and very vicious, brutal attacks that we face as a people. Children shouldn't have to worry about playing with toys in parks without being shot and killed.
Mhm. Okay, well, that's going to wrap it up for us. We're just about at time. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and I'd like to thank you, Ed, for sitting down with me for the hour. I want to encourage everybody who's watching to check out the rest of New Economy Week events. If you go to neweconomyweek.org, there's going to be a bunch of other panels like this, in-person events, and great written content for the rest of the week. And Ed, I wanted to give you the final word. If there's any, anything you'd like to add, or if there's any way you'd like to tell people to support some of what you've been talking about today.
Today is the day that a bunch of people are out in the streets around the Fight for 15.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give ups to that. I want to remind people that there's certainly negatives that we're going to hear about the undeserving poor and about folk who make bad choices, and this is why folk are poor. And we need to understand that the fundamental reason why people are poor is when they don't have access to the resources required to do things for themselves. And that there are a lot of undeserving rich who serve in the role of preventing and damaging that access, and that we have to build a struggle to convince the people who couldn't be convinced to share resources, and to build the power in other kind of situations to gain the resources that we need, so that again our communities can do what they need to do for themselves. That's it.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, Ed. Thanks to everybody for watching. And please do visit neweconomyweek.org for the rest of the week, so you can know about great conversations like this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.